Hello, and thank you for joining us on this episode, where we are going to discuss the impacts of lineage trauma on our children. We'll explore how childhood is not the only factor in behaviors and how our kids pick up energies within family systems. Today, we're joined by Jack Blackwell, a leader in the field of family constellation work. With 15 years of experience in leading lineage and family healing events, Jack's work focuses on the role of ancestry and generational patterns in shaping our lives. He helps individuals and families to unravel the complex patterns and dynamics passed down through generations, moving towards greater harmony and connections. Jack, welcome. I'm so glad that you can join us today.
Ed, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Jack, let's dive right in. Where does trauma come from, and how does it pass down through the generations?
Well, I think that's a great question, and particularly because the general focus for you and I and most of society is childhood trauma, and that's kind of the only thing that we see. It's kind of the only thing that our society teaches about, and yet there's a whole nother level of trauma that can be impacting us, and that is the trauma that happened to our ancestors. What happened to grandmother? What happened to grandfather? Was he abused as a boy? Did grandmother receive a sexual trauma? Did the people leave the homeland? So all of these create trauma imprints. And in addition to just our childhood story, we through birth we receive these patterns. We receive the patterns of what happened to grandma and grandpa, great grandma and great grandpa, what happened to our mother. Like we inherit as part of our inheritance in the family. Um, and it's really the unresolved traumas.
Hmm.
It's the things that the family wasn't able to integrate, they weren't able to look at, etc. So I think for you and I, it's like there are multiple levels to the places the trauma can come from.
So sometimes if you're looking at a behavior of your child and maybe you feel like your child is off, or there's something seems to be a disconnect. Sometimes we look at on the surface of like maybe it's something that's happening at school or something that's happening in the house where that actually their behavior is actually being affected by something that's happened within the past, maybe not in their past, but within the family's dynamics past, where a mom or a father hasn't really got complete on something that's happened in the history of their family.
Yeah, exactly. I think we can see it just as a generalized example of a child who's kind of ostracized.
Hmm.
And not only are they ostracized and people just kind of pick on them, but there's in some ways they're even manifesting of themselves. They kind of do just the wrong thing and they'll get kind of be an outsider or a black sheep. And, the kids can have a ton of support. Mom and dad can support them. Their brothers and sisters can support them. People in their community very loving towards them. And yet they keep manifesting this pattern of ostracization. And we can look at on a lineage trauma level, and we can see that, let's say, grandmother was also ostracized. And so
Hmm.
we can look at it generationally and we start to see, well, maybe it skipped mom and dad's generation, but maybe grandma or grandfather, because let's say they came to the country, they were immigrants, they just came to the country and they were the kid that spoke a different language or something like that. And it was a very traumatizing experience for grandma or grandpa.
Hmm.
Well, that energy of that trauma doesn't go away. Now, maybe it skips a generation. Maybe mom and dad come out, really healthy and do really well in life. But it's almost like in the generations, the child will pick up this unresolved pain that grandma or grandpa experienced and act it out
Hmm.
and actually recreate it. It's almost an example of like this energy just kind of floats around and someone will catch it and then hopefully they'll be trying to resolve it on some very deep level.
And sometimes you'll hear the story too, Jack. Well, you'll hear parents sometimes say, "Well, my mother, when I was growing up, my mother did it this way, and I'll never do it that way." Or when I was
Yeah.
growing up, my grandfather always told me, "But this is how the world was, and this is how you should live your life." So we carry these stories into our present lives, and we don't even realize how we're carrying those past stories and those past experiences unconsciously into how we're raising our teenagers right now.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you bring up a really great point, which is, and I see a fair number of parents that get kind of trapped in this. They're like, I'm never going to do it like my mother did. And on one level, that's helpful, right? There's a commitment. It's going to be different for my child, but it's almost like it's coming from a rejection energy. And when, let's say, the mom rejects her mother, I'm never going to do it like my mom did to me. The kids many times will pick up the opposite patterns. Like my mother, grandma, never loved me, mom, and so I'm going to be overly loving. I'm going to be so loving to my son. I'm going to be so loving to my daughter. And yet the son or daughter is like, I don't feel lovable.
Hmm.
I don't feel lovable. I mean, I know my mom is saying this stuff to me. And it's almost like the mother in a way has to go back and do the work around the trauma and wound with her mom, with grandma. And so as parents, whenever we're coming from a place of rejecting our own mothers or fathers, the children will feel an imprint of that. There's something very strong in family constellation work that says everyone's story has to be honored. Everyone's trauma has to be honored. Whatever it was that our mother went through, the reason they couldn't perhaps love us or hold us or whatever. It's so helpful to, and I saw on your last podcast episode, I was looking at this, we talked about the generational stories.
Yeah.
When we can have compassion and true empathy for whatever grandma or grandma went through and hold that in our hearts and then say to our child, I'm gonna do it differently than my mom did. My mom didn't have the skills, she didn't have the tools. It hurt me a lot, but I still love my mother, and I recognize the pain and trauma she went through, and I'm gonna do it differently than she did it. Like when we come from that place, a place of greater wholeness within the family, then I think the trauma pattern really starts to be healed.
And I think that word trauma too, Jack, I can imagine parents are listening to this and you hear the word trauma, and sometimes we take the word trauma and we put it into a category of with trauma. When we think of trauma, we think of really, really bad things like abuse, real violence. But the trauma comes in so many different forms than just the extremes. And sometimes I think we overstep that and we don't realize that trauma can come from your upbringing in terms of poverty. Trauma can come from, like to your point, being ostracized. Trauma can become from where you were born on this planet, and the resources that you have in your life. As a parent, and I'm thinking about, as a parent, I might be like, geez, this is a pretty heavy conversation, and I don't know if I really want to go that deep, and I don't know if I really want to go that back, all the way back and look at my lineage. So how do you navigate that to be like, maybe I'm kind of afraid. I don't really want to go back and dig up the past or dig up all those stories. Is there a way to do it in a way that's maybe is not as scary?
One of the things about family constellation work that's fascinating is this experiential process where we kind of recreate role playing of the family, but somehow we're able to access deeper wisdom and truths and insights. But it's a love-based modality. It's a love-based modality. So yes, while we do have to go on the ups and downs of some of the pain in the lineage, what we see is at this deeper level, mom and dad, I believe, grandma and grandpa, I believe, truly love us. They may not be able to express it psychologically because of whatever happened to them, but at the core, at the deepest level of our family systems, and I tend to view things more spiritually, not religiously, but spiritually. And what I see is there's tremendous love. There's tremendous love. It gets blocked. People are afraid to express it because of their own just terrors and fears. And the key to looking at the family trauma, the key and the real struggle that we have is, as you just kind of expressed, we have to have enough support. I
Hmm.
believe when you and I have enough support in our lives and are truly feel loved up either by community or psychotherapeutic support or whatever it is, we have the strength to look at anything. We
Yeah.
have the strength to feel it and to go through it. And trauma is a word, it's a loaded word in some ways because we have these visual experiences that come with us, but trauma is just an energetic pattern that lives in our body
Mm.
that when it gets touched causes us to do things that we don't really like.
Yeah.
that aren't in our greatest self-interest.
Hmm. I love how you frame that too of if you approach this, you're approaching it from the space and from that vibrational level of love. That if you're going back to look at your lineage and you're going back to look at your history and kind of knowing your story of how did you get to where you are, then when you explore that from the space of love, not for not exploring it to fix something, not exploring it to change something or to find out what's wrong with me or even what's wrong with my child or what's wrong with our family. It's more out of a you're doing this search and this exploration of I want to know where I came from. I want to know my history out of love
Mhm.
for my family. And if you come from that space, then there's not as much fear. There's more of
Yeah,
excitement and possibility of what can I learn from this? That's a beautiful
yeah.
space to be in.
And who were these beings? And somehow through this process of family constellation work, we're actually able to kind of see them three-dimensionally, and somehow we're able to access aspects of grandma and grandpa and actually get a flavor. And usually, what we find, is like, oh my God, this really resonates for me. Like that's exactly what my mother would have said. That's exactly what my father would have said. And if I could share just a little tiny story on my side, I'm right now, right back here, I'm in the country of Moldova, right?
Wow.
This is where my ancestors came from. This is where my great grandmother and my great grandfather on my dad's side of the lineage came from. And I came back to Moldova to visit for the first time ever. And I think my family hadn't been here for probably 100 years. And there was something about Moldova that just feels like home in my body. It's
Uh,
like it feels so good to be here. And as I looked at the lineage stories, the trauma that they went through, my great grandmother and great grandfather were sent away from Moldova to America for a chance at a better life.
wow.
And they took this journey in I believe 1911, 1912. They never saw their parents alive again. So they had this tremendous lineage trauma of what happened.
Mhm.
There was some pogroms, and there was some really that side of my family is Jewish, and there was some really brutal things that happened to the people. And I always had this judgment, like we're talking about this love level of families. I always had this judgment of my dad's side of the lineage because these men were kind of collapsed. They
Mhm.
really didn't express themselves very well in life. They didn't thrive in life in many ways. But as I did the healing work on this, I was like, oh my gosh, no wonder. There's this huge disconnect between the boys in the lineage. They sent all four of their sons away to America one by one when they had the money,
Mhm.
and they never saw their boys again alive. And so there's this huge generational trauma, this generational break. And recently I had an awareness, I had an aha, like, oh my God, how loving were my great great grandmother and my great great grandfather to send their boys away to give them a chance at life, because in Russia, things were really bad for the Jews.
Mhm.
And I really grasped like this, rather than just the trauma story, the actual love story of to send their children away. Like, how loving was that to give them a better chance?
It's such a beautiful story, Jack, because it emphasizes that when you do look back and you see and you connect the dots and you kind of and you see that path, that greater understanding gives you great pride and I think it deepens the
Yeah.
love for who you are and for the family that you have in your life right now. Jack, there's been I'm sure you've heard the studies how, during traumatic moments in history, when children are born during those traumatic moments, there's an energy vibration that happens where the moms are affected, and the babies are affected. For example, even like during 9/11, when that happened, there was a lot of trauma happening around with children at that time, and unease and that that a fear that was instilled right there at the moment because it was such a traumatic time. I think that research kind of emphasized just how important it is for as parents to know that when your energy is off, when you're frantic and when you're stressed and when you're really anxious, and you might not be articulating it verbally, uh, energetically though, your kids know when you are angry and you're upset. Can you say more about that, Jack?
Yeah, two things come up for me, and I'm not sure if you've heard of this experiment. There's a famous epigenetic experiment. We call it the mouse experiment. And so for people to listen to this, this idea of what happened to grandma, what happened to mom, that state of birth that they were in, what happened during the time of birth. You see this in World War II, women who are pregnant and this trauma gets passed down. But in this famous epigenetic experiment, they took a male mouse and they gave this mouse a slight electric jolt. And every time they gave it the slight jolt, they would pair it with the scent of cherry blossoms. And eventually, this male mouse would just get the scent of cherry blossoms and would respond as if it was being jolted. And it was not, right? It was just feeling like, oh, scent of cherry blossoms, a trauma response of the body anyway. And then they took out the sperm of this mouse and they impregnated a female that had never had anything to do with this experiment, never met this male mouse or anything like that. And they impregnated her, but she didn't have anything to do with this male mouse or the experiment. And she had babies called pups, and then she had grandbabies, right? So if you and I think about what happened to our ancestors, what happened to grandma, what happened to grandpa, and what are the trauma responses in our bodies? Well, they had these grandbaby mice, and they didn't shock, none of that. They just gave it the scent of the cherry blossoms, and these grandbabies responded with a trauma response.
Wow.
So this trauma, just through the sperm of this male, transferred over to this female, and then the grandbabies 2 generations later still have the trauma response.
Wow. It's
And so
incredible.
how much of the hard things that we face in life, how much are ours, and how much are actually mom and dad's or grandma and grandpa's?
So Jack, so if I'm listening to this as a parent, I'm like, all right, so how, and I want to sort of know a little bit more about my history. I want to know a little bit more about my lineage, beyond maybe the stories that I've been told growing up about mom or about dad or about grandma, grandpa. Like, how do you, is there a couple great places to go to look for your lineage, to look at your ancestry? I mean, I know you hear the commercials on ancestry.com. I mean, but are there some other great resources that you can explore to find that
Sure.
lineage?
Sure. One is kind of what your last guest spoke to, and there's a beautiful New York Times article also about the power of generational stories. And many things, because of the trauma, these things aren't talked about, but even knowing the stories of our lineage is super valuable and brings resource and brings strength. There's also an amazing dramatization on Netflix for those that watch Netflix. And the show is called Another Self, and it is a Turkish series, subtitles, but it's a really well done dramatization of this process where people are healing intergenerational trauma. So it's beautiful to see it, even though it's a drama, done 3 dimensionally. And so
Wow.
that's a great thing. And I invite people to come to my events. I have lead events almost weekly where people can actually step in and role play roles of mom and dad and actually see how this 3 dimensional process works, and start to gain insight to, oh man, what's happening with my son Mike, and the fact that he's carrying all this rage, or he carries depression. Like for example, I carried the shame for my family, so I had to work through all there's a lot of shame energy in my lineage. So doing this process and cleaning that up. So those are a couple of resources.
And that's one of your unique strategies that you use, right, Jack, when you're really helping teens or like, you know, kind of get complete on some of maybe some unresolved issues, is that you take them through that unique process that's unique to what you do, correct?
Yes, and one of the interesting things about family constellation work that's pretty cool, and I think it adds a lot of value, is that other members of the family don't have to do there to work this experiential process. Let's say, little Mike doesn't want to come, or it feels like it'd be too much for him. Mom can come on his behalf and say, hey, I want to do this energetic process to see what's my son carrying? What's my daughter carrying that she's responding in this way? Or perhaps the husband or the wife is not so supportive. And so one parent can choose to come and do this process and, in a way, do it for the energetics of the entire family.
It's
So
beautiful.
it's nice not to have to bring all 3 people together in what can be a pretty challenging, intense experience and energy of, let's say, a psychotherapeutic setting.
And this family constellation work, is it something that you have to do in person, or is it something that I could do with you on a through like a Zoom call?
You know, we all thought it had to be done in person, but then once the pandemic hit, we actually tested and we realized we can do the process online. So
Wow,
I'm able to work with my American clients from here in Moldova,
it's
Eastern
amazing.
Europe. Yeah,
Jack, if we want to get more information about your work and about what you do, how do we do that?
sure. And I'd also love to answer any questions anybody has around generational trauma. And, if they come to me with like, oh, here's what's going on with my daughter. Do you have any thoughts? I'm happy to, no cost, just converse and share with people.
Thank you.
People can reach me at my website, healingfamilytrauma.com,
Okay.
or they can reach out to me, my name, Jack, at healingfamilytrauma.com.
Awesome, Jack. And Jack, one fun question for you. If you could have
Yeah.
a huge billboard on the side of the road and you could have that billboard say anything on it, what would you have it say on on that billboard?
That the trauma that we live with, the responses that we have in our bodies are not just childhood based, that we actually inherit the traumas of our ancestors. And so doing childhood trauma is super valuable. Working with ancestral trauma is equally valuable. And many times if we can't resolve the issue, it's because it lives in our family system. So ancestral work is so important. And so here's an opportunity to do that work also.
Jack, you're really making a difference in people's lives, and you're really making a difference in healing families. And I really want to acknowledge you for the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ed. And I love what you're putting out there, and you're just so passionate about it. And even in that vibe, I think people can feel that and feel your warmth around it. So appreciate being here with you.
Thank you, Jack. Until next time, thank you listening to Navigating the Teen Years. Keep on shining your light.
Great.